To introduce Martina. Martina Favaretto is the postdoctoral fellow here, and she'll be talking today on Kant and Kant on emotion and moral worth. And we already settled that she's correct about what she's going
to say. Well, thank you for being here. This is, again, a work in progress, so it's particularly helpful to have your feedback. Okay, good. So Kant on emotions and moral worth. So Kant is traditionally taken to hold the view that emotions are insufficient for moral worth, and then is contrasted with the virtue ethicist who instead holds that emotions are rather necessary for moral worth. So now, like in the recent years, scholars have pointed out that even by Kant's own lights, emotions are appropriately connected to reasons and values. And some of these scholars, so I'm going to focus particularly on Kyla Abel-Dagan's work, and pointed out that the fact that emotions are connected to value and reasons, gives us reasons for thinking that emotions should be considered as sufficient, albeit not necessary, for moral worth. So today I'm going to argue that it's true that Kant thinks that emotions are connected to values and reasons, but that we should not conclude that emotions are sufficient for moral worth. So I'm going to argue that acting from duty and acting from inclination should be kept distinct, and only acting from duty as moral worth for Kant. Okay, so the first thing to notice here, a terminological point, is that Kant really does not has a German word for emotions, for the set of mental states that the English term emotion picks out. So rather it talks about separate emotions and uses somewhat of a technical language. So for instance, it talks about feeling, desire, inclination, affects, passions. And so today, just to be clear, I'm going to focus on feeling and desire and the relation that Kant sees between them. So the relation is such that, it is explained in the introduction of the Metaphysics of Morals. So Kant writes that first, pleasure or displeasure, susceptibility to which is called feeling, is always connected with desire or aversion. So in bringing about an action, there's always a connection between pleasure and desire. So they are necessarily connected. And then it tells us that this connection is of, a special kind and is such that the feeling precedes and causes the desire. He writes that determination of the faculty of desire, which is caused and therefore necessarily preceded by such pleasure, is called the desire in the narrow sense, and habitual desire is called inclination. Okay, so when you hear inclination, just think of habitual desire. Okay, good. So now let us start with, desire and see how it is connected to value. We're going to inquire about the link, if any, that desire has with value, and we're going to do that through contrasting different views of how desire affects agency. Okay, so the first view that I'm going to consider is the hydraulic view. This is the view according to which the agent is caused to act by her desires, and if desires are in conflict, the stronger one wins. So this is a fairly non-cognitivist picture, according to which desires are brute forces, and so mere occurrences that just happen to the agent and cause the agent to act. And it's very clear that Kant rejects the hydraulic view. So he does that, especially in the religion, in this passage in which he points to the consideration that has been, to a thesis that has been dubbed by Henry Allison as the incorporation thesis. And he claims that we are not overcome by desire, rather we incorporate our desires into maxims. And this means that inclination, desires, feeling, impulses do not cause us to act. We have a certain agency, like in relation to them. And like Kant, it's clear that Kant rejects it, but he rejects it for good reasons. In fact, if you adopt the hydraulic view, it's very difficult to see why, what it means to be an agent at all. And it's hard to see, for instance, why we should care more or differently about a person who treats us badly than about some other force of nature. So, for instance, a hurricane just, like happening to us, and why, we should advance any claims about moral responsibility. Okay, so, but even though Kant rejects the hydraulic view, many still attribute to Kant, including many Kantians, a non-cognitivist view when it comes to desire. And to see this, consider Christine Korsgaard's double aspect theory of motivation. And this is like a theory that is presented by Korsgaard as Kantian, and I think that it is fairly Kant's. So according to the double aspect view, inclination makes a proposal to the agent about how to act, and the agent considers the proposal and then either accepts it or rejects it. Okay, so the double aspect view advances the normative claim that desire does not, all by itself, provide sufficient reason for action. And this means that no inclination settles for the agent the question of how to act. And moreover, the question of how to act, whether to fly, is distinct from the question of what you want, so whether you are inclined to fly. Those are just two different questions according to the double aspect view. So to determine your will according to the double aspect view is to reason explicitly to a conclusion about whether to fly and to be vulnerable to justificatory challenges that would be met by citing the merits of flying, just in case you intend to fly. Okay, so this is the extent according to which the double aspect view differs from the hydraulic view. However, it is worth noticing that the double aspect view and the hydraulic view agree on a certain thing. Namely, they agree representing the agent as passive with respect to what inclination the agent has. And so the proposals that these inclinations make. So the idea here is that, you are passive in respect to what desires you have, they just happen to you. And so it just happened to you that these desires make a proposal in the first place. And your agency appears only on the second moment of motivation, the one in which you determine your will. Okay, so now Abel-Duggins puts forth an evaluation of the double aspect view according to which the double aspect view is problematic because desire so conceived could not bear on the question of how to act. So a mere force, according to Abel-Duggins, is not only insufficient to settle the question. So it's not only that is a problem, but it's also the wrong kind of thing that could serve as a practical reason. So if inclination is just being subject to a force, then it provides the agent who decides to act from it no resources for answering the justificatory challenges to which such a decision is vulnerable. Okay, so constructed as a force of disposition, inclination has no content in relation to the value or choice worthiness of a course of action. And so for this reason, it could not be a reason, sorry for the repetition, and it could not be either, a certain kind of reason, like a candidate of a provisional or presumptive reason. So to think that a force could serve as a reason, then according to this interpretation, is just to commit a category mistake in a certain sense. It's just something else that could not provide a reason. So understood as a mere urge or force, an inclination is not making a proposal, but only applying pressure to the agent. And so then the double aspect view tells us that what matters is that reason can push back against this pressure. But this way of putting things as the problem of constructing causally what ought to be constructed normatively. So for instance, it indicates, like, it focuses on the push of inclination and the force of the will instead of focusing on the proposal advanced by inclination and the judgment of the will. So according to Abel-Duggins, we fully reject the hydraulic view and adopt the double aspect view. We should also adopt another conception of desire that she calls the normatively laden view of desire. And here I think that the idea is that the double aspect view is just incoherent if it regards desire as something else other than the normatively laden view of desire. It's incoherent because it treats desire as something that could provide a reason for acting, whereas in fact it would construct desire only as a brute force, something that could not be conceived of as a reason. Okay, so now the normatively laden view of desires is the view according to which desires are connected to claims about the value or choice worthiness of a course of action. And in order to advance a proposal or make a normative claim, desires has to represent so acting as choice worthy, so as valuable in a particular way. And desire then must be constructed as representation of value and properly responsive to value. So if desire are normatively laden representations, not mere forces, then they open us to justificatory questions. That is, it is apt to ask why you want what you want. And according to Abel-Duggins, this has also the nice consequence of thinking that according to this picture, we can, at least to a certain extent, be responsible for our desires. And this has nice features for thinking about moral development and virtue in general. Okay, good. So now let's see how the normatively laden view of desire has consequences for thinking about moral worth. So now I'm going to start with this passage from the groundwork, which is a little long, but I think it's very important to read, so I'm going to read it. So bear with me. So here Kant writes that to be beneficent where one can is a duty. And besides, there are many souls so sympathetically attuned that without any other motives of vanity or self-interest, they find an inner satisfaction in spreading joy around them and can take delight in the satisfaction of others so far as it is their own work. But I assert that in such a case, an action of this kind, however it may conform with duty and however amiable it may be, has nevertheless no true moral worth, but is on the same footing with other inclinations. For example, the inclination to honor, which, if it unfortunately lights upon what is in fact in the common interest and in conformity with duty, and hence honorable, deserves praise and encouragement, but not esteem. For the maxim lacks moral content, namely that of doing such actions, not from inclination, but from duty. Suppose then that the mind of this philanthropist were overclouded by his own grief, which extinguished all sympathy with the fate of others, and that while he still had the means to benefit others in distress, their troubles did not move him because he had enough to do with his own. And suppose that now, when no longer incited to it by any inclination, he nevertheless tears himself out of this deadly insensibility and does that action without any inclination, simply from duty. Then the action first has its genuine moral worth. Okay, so Kant here is presenting us with two very different agents, so the sympathetic helper and the dutiful helper, and he's telling us that the sympathetic helper has an immediate inclination to act, and is therefore acting from inclination, and is telling us that the sympathetic helper's action has no true moral worth. Instead, the dutiful helper is an agent who has no longer any other inclination, and acts simply from duty, and his action, according to Kant, has true moral worth. They are done without inclination, but simply from duty. Okay, so now on the normatively laden view of desire, the sympathetic helper acts according to his desire's representation of the person in need as calling for help. So the fact that the sympathetic helper has an immediate inclination to help, it means that it's regarding helping as something valuable, and moreover that is representing other people as, like being worthy of help. So they are valuable as well because they're worthy of help. So conceived as normatively laden, desire can represent our fellow human beings, this is according to Abel Duggins, as worthy of both respect and love. And so to act on a desire so constructed would be to act in response to the value that we attribute to these other human beings. And so it would be to act to be properly responsive to the value of humanity. So if this is true, then, it raises the problem of how to differentiate between the sympathetic helper and the dutiful helper. For why the sympathetic helper's action, if it were true that the sympathetic helper is properly responsive to the value of humanity, so why should his action lack moral worth? So it seems like, a good question to ask. And in fact, both the sympathetic helper and the dutiful helper would represent the value of humanity, though in different ways. And indeed, there is, a sense in which the sympathetic helper might even be regarded as better off than the dutiful helper, because it does not only represent the value of humanity to himself, but he also, seems to regard other people's suffering as a reason for helping, whereas the dutiful helper is not as responsive to the suffering of others. Okay, so Kyla Abel-Duggins points out that there are some ways in which one might draw the distinction between the dutiful helper and the sympathetic helper. For instance, one may say, well, the sympathetic helper is somebody who acts unreflectively, whereas the dutiful helper would be somebody who acts instead with full reflection. And that's why Kant would tell us that the dutiful helper, his action has true moral worth because it's done reflectively with the right kind of reflective attitude. But Abel-Duggins thinks that this is not, a good way of going, because a lot of work in Kant scholarship has been done to show that acting from duty does not have to be something that you reflectively do and deliberate, outspokenly. And so it's something that can be done unreflectively as well. And so that kind of distinction is not going to make it. Now, it's if it's true, as Abel-Duggins argued, that both the sympathetic helper and the dutiful helper represent to themselves the value of humanity, then we should dismiss the idea that acting from duty and acting from inclinations are so different in kind. So this is a nice quote from Abel-Duggins. So she writes, we should dismiss the idea that inclination and duty are different in kind. We can base a positive assessment on just the content of the normatively significant attitudes it makes sense to ascribe to him, to the sympathetic helper. His action demonstrates commitment to the idea that others have a claim on his help, even if offering help is of no instrumental value to him, and even if he doesn't feel like helping them. It thereby demonstrates a distinctively moral commitment and so has moral worth. So, like, the idea here is that independently from its causal history, the content of the desires will matter, and the content is the representation of the value of others. And so, in a certain sense, it is a picture according to which, the desire is able to direct us to recognize this kind of value. So it's value tracking in the sense that it just points us and make us gain access to the right kind of representation, that is the representation that entails the value of humanity. Okay, so, what should we say about the normatively laden view of desires and Abel Dagan's, conclusion that acting from duty and acting from inclination are not different in kind? Well, I should also add that to say that acting from inclination and acting from duty are not different in kind means that, according to Abel Dagans, that acting from inclination can be sufficient, albeit not necessary for moral worth. Okay, so should we agree with this picture? Like, in order to do so, we have to bring feeling into focus and talk about feeling and what feeling is for Kant. And the reason for this is that Kant tells us that there is a necessary connection between desire and feeling, and this necessary connection between them when bringing about an action is such that is a causal connection of a certain kind. So yeah, we have to look into that in order to assess the proposal. So we're going to start with trying to figure out what feeling is for Kant. Okay, so what is feeling for Kant? So a standard way of understanding feeling within Kant's work is a fairly non-cognitivist one. So this is a view put forth, for instance, by Beck and more recently by Paul Guyer. And this is a view according to which, for Kant, feelings are brute sensation-like states that are opaque in the sense that they provide no insight into their causal history. And this is it's very similar to the brute force kind of view. Though according to this view, feelings are just sensation, so they are brute occurrences in a certain sense. And this reading, it is somewhat, at least prima facie, warranted by Kant's insistence when talking about feeling on differentiating feeling from cognition. So, for instance, in the Metaphysics of Morals, is very clear about this. So he writes that feeling cannot, provide any cognition regarding the properties of the objects towards which we have a feeling. So he writes the following. So the capacity for having pleasure or displeasure in a representation is called feeling, because both of these involve what is merely subjective in the relation of our representation and contain no relation at all to an object for possible cognition of it, or even cognition of our own condition. Well, even sensation, apart from the quality, for instance, red, sweet, and so forth, because of the nature of the subject, are still referred to an object as elements in our cognition of it. Pleasure and displeasure, or in what is red or sweet, expresses nothing at all in the object, but simply a relation to the subject. They are ideas that do not represent objects, but refers to sensations within us. Okay, so here Kant is telling us that pleasure is a sensation, but a certain kind of sensation, a subjective one. And in fact, he differentiates between subjective sensation and objective sensation. So objective sensation can be an element of cognition, where a subjective one, the one that regards feeling, cannot be an element of cognition. And and so, from this we can say that Kant emphasizes that feeling, pleasure and displeasure, are non-cognitive in at least one strong sense. They do not provide us with objective theoretical cognition of the properties of the objects in which we find pleasure and displeasure. So now also something important to notice is that I'm talking about pleasure and displeasure because Kant thinks that all feelings like boil down to either pleasure or displeasure. So keep that in mind. So when I'm talking about pleasure, you should think feeling. So I'm gonna use them interchangeably. Okay, but even though Kant's account of feeling is non-cognitivist in this sense, so like it is still true that this account of feeling does not fit neatly into a non-cognitivist framework. And the reason for this is that Kant thinks that feeling is directed towards an object, and so it has intentionality. And is a function of the agent's capacity to represent an object in a particular way. So feeling has intentionality, and it entails that you are representing the intentional object in a certain way. So it makes this clear, for instance, in the first critique. Take this passage. Here is telling us that objective sensation, the one that are about perception of an object, they have an object in the sense of Gegenstand. But subjective sensation, the one that are about feeling, they do not have an object in the sense of Gegenstand, but yet they have an object in the sense of object. And this is like an object of our liking, which is not a cognition of it. So, it's very clear that he thinks that feeling as an intentional object. And if that's true, then we have to figure out which kind of representation, like that, that representation of the intentional object is about. Okay, so the representation involved in feeling is of the object's agreement with what Kant calls, quite mysteriously, the subject's condition of life. So he makes this clear in several passages. For instance, in the second critique, he writes that pleasure is the representation of an agreement, of an object, or of an action with the subjective conditions of life, that is, with the faculty of the causality of our representation with respect to the reality of its object, or with respect to the determination of the powers of the subject to action in order to produce the object. That's a mouthful. So, but in explaining this further, for instance, in the anthropology, it kind of tells us that enjoyment is the feeling of promotion of life, pain is the hindrance of it. And in his lecture notes, he writes that if we compare all cases which provide us pleasure and displeasure, we find generally that everything being in accord with making life palpable to us give us pleasure, and that everything that binds our faculties of life arouses pain. The principle of all pleasure and pain lies thus in the facilitation or binding of our faculties of life. We experience pleasure and pain as life being promoted or hindered. Okay, so the idea is that this life being promoted or hindered refers to the activity of the subject. So it's life activity. Okay, so now through the representation of the object agreement with this condition of life, the subject represent the object as valuable. And feeling in representing this relation are determination of value, then, and because of this, they motivate. So the idea is that, like the subject, perceives an agreement between the object and the condition of life. So there is agreeableness between the two. And because there is agreeableness, like the subject is taking that object to be valuable. And so the ascription of value is there. So now I'm going to, this is something I haven't fully figured out, but, I'm gonna maybe shift between talking about the subject conferring value onto object and the subject and the feelings tracking value. So, I'm not quite sure whether the picture is that the value is there and, the feeling is tracking it, or whether, the subject confers value, creates this value. So, that's something I haven't figured out yet. But in any case, this picture, you can see how this picture is fairly value cognitive. So it's not cognitivist in the sense that, it's still true that the feeling cannot tell you anything about the properties of the object, but it is value cognitive in the sense that it points to value. Okay, and albeit feelings cannot be itself a judgment of value, precisely because, it cannot ascribe properties, but nonetheless, it can be connected to judgments of value. So upon reflection, the subject can, think about this relation and make a judgment. Okay, so now let's see how, we have seen what feeling is according to Kant. Now let's see, whereas Kant's account of feeling can support the normatively laden view of desire and or Kyla Abel-Dagan's conclusion that acting from inclination can be sufficient for moral worth. Okay, so on the one hand, the value cognitive understanding of feeling supports like the normatively laden view of desire. And you can see why. So the feeling is necessarily connected with desire because it provides desire with its intentional object. So it is not merely the cause of the desire. So it is the cause of the desire, but it's significant not merely as a cause. It's significant because it provides the desire with its intentional object. And it is in this sense that feeling is the determining ground of the desire. So, and another way of saying this is that feeling is what explains why the agent sees the object of the desire as desirable in the first place. Like it is of value because of this agreeableness between the object and the subject's conditions of life. So, this doesn't mean, however, that the agent must represent to herself the object as a means to get pleasure. So this does not mean that the agent thinks, that the dutiful helper thinks that, actively thinks that helping others is a means to getting pleasure. So this is ruled out by Kant explicitly in the text. In fact, it's telling us that the dutiful helper and the sympathetic helper share the same end, namely the well-being of others. So it is truly the sympathetic helper's end, like his genuine hand to help others. It's not that like in his mind is thinking about his own pleasure. And in fact, Kant is differentiating like the sympathetic helper from the self-interested shopkeeper. And he's telling us that the sympathetic helper truly has an immediate inclination to help. So in a certain sense, then, it's like this picture tells us that Kant is not committed to a psychological form of hedonism, even though he's committed to some form of hedonism that is not psychological. Okay, so on the other end, however, the value cognitive understanding of feeling discourages Abel-Dagan's conclusion that acting from inclination can be sufficient for moral worth. And the reason for this is that it is through the representation of the object's agreement with her condition of life, with her life activity, that the subject confers value onto the object. So helping others of value of the sympathetic helper on the condition that it accords with her life activity. So if this is true, then you can see how sympathy, the sympathetic helper's sympathy, does not respond to the value of humanity, merely responds to the value that the agent places on the agreeableness of the object with his life activity. And so if this is true, it does not display a moral commitment, rather it displays a responsiveness to something that is taken to be good for the subject's condition. Contingently for the subject conditions. Okay, so the judgment of value that may be connected to the sympathetic helper's sympathy then would be also subjective because it is a judgment only of the apparent good for the subject experiencing this feeling. Okay, so but now one might ask, why can it be the case that the sympathetic helpers, okay, like it is about pleasure, is representing the object as agreeable with his own condition of life, but why couldn't be the case that the representation of this is a kind of pleasure that has something to do with morality? So again, maybe this is a pleasure of a certain kind that displays some form of moral commitment or moral concern. But this cannot be the case in Kant's own life, because for Kant, like pleasure does not admit of kinds, but only of degrees. This is something that Kant is explicit about, and he writes about in the second critique again. He writes, if the determination of his will rests on the feeling of agreeableness or disagreeableness that he expects from some cause, it is all the same to him by what kind of representation is affected. The only thing that concerns him in order to decide upon a choice is how intense, how long, how easily acquired, and how often repeated disagreeableness is. So there are no kinds of pleasure. There's only degrees according to these standards. Okay, so if given this, we might say that the representation of the object's agreement with one's condition of like may come with a certain degree, for instance. So in relation with this degree, one would confer more or less value onto objects. So like depending on the degree of the agreeableness between the helping others and the sympathetic helper's life activity, depending on that, the sympathetic helper would confer more or less value onto helping others. But this also is significant because moral value, according to Kant, is something that does not admit of degrees. So it's either there or it's not. So this is a significant way in which the kind of value involved in the sympathetic helper's situation is different from moral value. Okay, so now, like, why can it be the case, though, that the sympathetic helper, acts from sympathy, okay, but why can it be the case that his sympathy works in an epistemic manner such that it points to the right kind of value, moral value, the value of humanity? So to put it as Kai Label Daggans puts it. So why can it be the case that he acts from inclination, but at the same time, that inclination points him towards the right kind of value? And I think that like the reason for this is, is just that, pleasure is not merely the cause of the desire, but it provides the intentional object. So that kind of reasoning like provides us with grounds for thinking that this it cannot be the case that he acts from inclination and at the same time accesses like the right kind of value. Okay, so moreover, the relation between the sympathetic helper and the pleasure as a determining ground is very explicit in Kant's addressing, this kind of scenario in the second critique. So he writes that it is very beautiful to do good to human beings from love for them and from sympathetic benevolence, or to be just from love of order. But this is not yet the genuine moral maxims of our conduct, the maxim befitting our position among rational beings as human beings, when we presume with proud conceit, like volunteers, not to trouble ourselves about the thought of duty, and as independent of command, to want to do of our own pleasure what we think we need no command to do. So here, more than the groundwork, Kant highlights, the importance of pleasure in the picture for the sympathetic helper's action. Okay, so now, given this analysis, I'm going to conclude that even though feelings are value referring. They do not refer to moral value on Kant's account. And so we should reject Abel Dagan's claim that acting from duty and acting from inclination are not different in kind, and acting from inclination can be sufficient for moral worth. So it is still the case that these two things are different in kinds, and acting from inclination is still insufficient for moral worth. Okay, yes, I'm looking forward to your feedback.